I am the sheriff in this small Texas town, hidden away among endless fields and lonely highways. Our town had always been quiet. People knew each other. The livestock grazed peacefully on the ranches, and the biggest gossip usually stemmed from someone's loud family celebration. But then everything changed. The first ominous news came with reports of attacks on the livestock. Early in the morning, farmers discovered their cows and horses torn apart, as if some wild beast had descended upon them. No one could explain what was happening. Some blamed stray pumas, others mentioned coyotes, yet everyone agreed that this was unlike any of the usual incidents we'd heard about before. When I was called to inspect one of the ranches, I immediately sensed an indescribable, eerie presence in the air. Shredded pieces of flesh were scattered about, and the ground was soaked with blood, as if someone with malicious glee and a grim delight had tormented these living creatures. It seemed as though the perpetrator wasn't merely a predator, but something with a consciousness, monstrously cruel. I tried to find traces of claws or footprints, but the dry, hard soil gave nothing away. The only clue I managed to spot was a tuft of fur caught on some torn bushes by a fence, suggesting that the killer or beast had leapt over the barrier. I took the fur to the veterinarian, who only shrugged. The fur looked strange, as if it didn't belong to any known animal species. Word of these events spread quickly, and soon residents were afraid to step outside at night. Curtains were drawn as darkness fell, and only the occasional dim beam from a street lamp pierced the gloom. No one wanted to become the next victim. The town fell silent under a suffocating atmosphere of fear, like a cold, deserted wasteland where the light had gone out, and a bitter wind chased around tattered scraps of old newspapers along empty sidewalks. The local church was bolted up with several locks, though its doors had once been open 24 hours a day to anyone in need. People began to see vague shapes on the streets, and even became frightened of the shadow cast by their own cars. Rumors raced through town. Some claimed to have seen a huge black figure running along the empty road, while others reported hearing a wild howl in the night. Many supposed it was a lone beast, yet local hunters could find neither a den nor bloody tracks or the carcasses of other animals in the area. In the evenings, I had to patrol the town to urge everyone to stick together and remain calm. But even that calm was absent from bars and shops. Customers would hurry in and leave immediately for home. A deep, unspoken terror of an unknown evil permeated the air. Then came the day of the first attack on a person, and fear reached its peak. The first victim was a lonely woman living near the edge of town. Her body had been savaged as though torn apart by claws and teeth. I was at my wits' end. The town demanded answers, and I couldn't provide any. Soon, more victims followed, each scene as horrifying as the last, and yet once again, I could find no solid clues. That's when the local press coined the term the curse of the Texas town. People started saying that an ancient evil had always haunted this place, and our generation was merely witnessing its awakening. Old-timers recalled strange legends of vanished tribes fleeing from something sinister, hidden deep beneath the earth. These stories were whispered in hushed tones, and in the eyes of the storytellers, I saw a terror that mirrored the one that had taken root in my own soul. Events took a new turn when I received a call from the far end of town reporting a brutal murder at the old hotel. I arrived at the scene at night, knowing that even a minute's delay could result in lost evidence. The hotel stood by the highway, its weathered sign barely legible and a few dim windows offering scant light. Usually it was just a pit stop for long-haul truckers, so for most locals it was an almost unnoticeable place. When I stepped inside, a stale smell of old carpet and something else, hard to pinpoint yet undeniably sinister, greeted me. The stairs leading to the rooms creaked underfoot. In the corridor, only a single flickering light bulb worked, as if warning me of the impending horror. Finally, I reached the room in question, and the sight that met my eyes left me in shock. The victim's body had been torn to shreds, just like the animals on the ranches. Everywhere were bloody stains, and the walls were splattered with deep crimson spots. I struggled to make sense of the chaos. What kind of madness could lead to such savagery, and who was capable of it? The mirrors in the room were shattered. Their fragments lay scattered on the floor, and the frames hung crookedly. It felt as though the assailant had either hated his own reflection or feared it. Beneath the bed, I found a small wooden figurine marked with an inscrutable symbol resembling an animal's snout. The handcrafted idol was covered in intricate carvings that clearly held some ritual significance. I felt a strange unease as I held it, as if the little object was imbued with a foul power. After combing through the room, I couldn't help but think that the killer either knew exactly what he was doing or was driven by a madness that led to senseless vandalism. But if it were just a predatory creature, what explained the obsession with mirrors? Why had they been shattered alongside the victim's gruesome dismemberment? I meticulously inspected every corner, baked on blood on the windowsill, scratches on the walls as if made by claws. I even walked down the corridor in search of footprints or traces on the carpet, but found nothing except vague stains that could belong to anyone. The doctor who arrived later confirmed my worst fears. The wounds resembled animal bites, but with an unnatural force that shredded flesh into pieces. I remembered the tuft of strange fur found at the ranch, and now here it was, again alongside the wooden figurine. I began to suspect that some cult, or a deranged fanatic, was performing rituals. Could all these atrocities be part of a blood-soaked rite? I decided to review the security camera footage, which was usually installed in hotels along corridors and in parking lots. Even though the old hotel wasn't expected to have an elaborate system, the owner had managed to hide a few cameras, giving me a chance to see who had entered the ill-fated room. The film was in black and white, riddled with noise and interference, but I could make out the faces of a few individuals. They had left the room about half an hour before the body was discovered and had been inside for less than a minute. In that brief span, it seemed impossible for them to have committed such a monstrous act, and yet emerged without any traces of blood on their clothes. I knew each of them. One owned a small store on the outskirts, another came from a farming family, and a third even served on the town council. They appeared to be ordinary citizens, never before implicated in any wrongdoing. I called each of them in for questioning. They were frightened and reticent, vehemently denying any involvement with the murder. They claimed they had been at a book club meeting and had stopped by the victim's place on the way. According to them, everything was fine with the woman, and she had said she'd be a little late. The meeting had been held at the local library, and as I later confirmed, these people really had been there. Yet something about them was suspicious. There just wasn't enough evidence to pin the crime on them directly. After releasing them, a growing sense of dread gnawed at me. As I rewatched the footage, I noticed another detail. At the far end of the corridor, a dark corner swallowed by shadows seemed to move, as if a figure lurked there. But upon replaying those seconds, I couldn't be sure if it was merely a film glitch. It might have been nothing more than recording noise, yet in light of the events, I felt as though I was witnessing something supernatural. A presence skirting the edge of visibility. The next day, waking with a leaden weight in my chest, I decided to visit the suspects at their homes for further questioning. even though I lacked hard evidence against them, it was clear they were hiding something. I first drove to the farmer's house, the same man whose family had appeared on the video. His home lay near the town's border, adjacent to the field where cows once grazed. Now, however, a deathly silence reigned, as if the very earth were filled with fear. The farmer answered the door looking dejected and listless. As I scanned the entryway, I noticed something on a shelf that resembled the very wooden figurine found at the hotel. I stepped closer. Indeed, it was adorned with the same symbol. I asked the owner to show me his other figurines, and it turned out he had an entire collection. He claimed they were all bought from the local carpenter. His eyes trembled with tension, even as he insisted that he had purchased them only because they were beautiful and unusual. I took one of the trembling pieces from his hands and examined it closely. A carving of a beast, covered in hieroglyphs or symbols. There was no doubt left. There was a direct connection to the murders. Yet he offered nothing more than a series of excuses. The same pattern emerged with the other suspects. In their homes, there were similar carved wooden idols. Some were displayed prominently, while others were hidden away in closets. It seemed that hundreds of these figurines had been whittled in our town, and many residents possessed them. The question arose, why? Were they all members of some secret society, or did they simply share an admiration for a peculiar craft? Naturally, I set myself the task of speaking directly with the carpenter. But first, I decided to question the neighbors of the suspects to see if they had noticed any other oddities. People claimed nothing out of the ordinary, yet their voices carried a nervous uncertainty. Perhaps they had seen nocturnal gatherings or heard strange sounds, but now they were too afraid to admit it, realizing that something dark and dangerous was unfolding in our town. With each new question, an inexorable horror loomed, silencing anyone who might shed light on the mystery. At one point, as I was returning to my car, I noticed that someone was following me. On a deserted street beneath the blazing Texas sun, random passers-by are virtually unheard of, especially during working hours. I spun around abruptly and saw an old man standing by an abandoned house. He seemed to waver, uncertain whether to approach me or slip away. I decided to take the initiative. As I moved toward him, he began to back away as if fearful. His face was pale, his wrinkles deepening the expression of terror, and his eyes darted about anxiously. I realized he was the same eccentric old fellow the townsfolk called the Madman. Detaining him wasn't easy. He kept trying to break free. But eventually, I managed to bring him to the station. Once seated, I attempted to calm him and take a closer look at his story. The old man trembled and mumbled incoherently, avoiding direct eye contact. Gradually, however, I began to grasp his meaning. He claimed that all the people under suspicion were up to something. He swore he had seen them gathering secretly at night. Yet, when it came to details about their meetings, the old man could offer nothing concrete. His accusations sounded fantastical, filled with talk of rituals and some kind of beast. Listening to him, I felt both skepticism and dread. Often, the crazy ones notice what escapes the rest of us. Perhaps he really had seen something that defied our rational understanding. The doubt swirled in my mind, for the clues pointed to a group of people operating in the town as part of a single chain. If the old man was right, then a force was at work in our homes, one that continued to kill and mutilate without any apparent external motive. And the key to unraveling it all lay with the mysterious carpenter, whose carved bestial images seemed to be deified and to bring with them a curse. I decided not to postpone a visit to the carpenter. After the conversation with the old man, I was convinced that all roads led to him. Gruesome murders, wooden idols bearing sinister symbols, and now talk of a secret cult. Too many coincidences for a mere craftsman. When I drove up to his workshop, located away from the residential areas, the sun was high in the sky. Yet a strange chill pervaded the old buildings. The carpenter's house looked gloomy and abandoned, although a neat sign reading "Carpentry Workshop" hung outside. I pushed open the heavy door and was immediately hit by a pungent smell of sawdust mixed with a sharp, almost putrid odor of dampness. Dim lamps cast weak light over the room, highlighting carved figurines and trinkets scattered on workbenches, shelves, and in drawers. They were literally everywhere. It seemed as if every object was watching me from a shadowy corner. Once my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed that all of these items shared a common symbol. A wolf-like snout or a paw with extended claws, encircled by swirls and lines reminiscent of runic inscriptions. The carpenter stood against the far wall, his arms folded across his chest, as if he'd been expecting me. He looked gaunt and sinewy, with deep-set eyes and long, slightly graying hair. His name was Tom. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary middle-aged man, but his gaze was so cold that it sent a shiver down my spine. I approached a table where a massive block of wood lay, resembling the beginning of some monstrous mask. It had a slightly ajar mouth with teeth akin to the snarl of a wolf, and at its base I noticed a symbol that looked like a blend of Native American motifs and something entirely foreign. The whole construction exuded a damp, unspoken threat. I tore my eyes away from this bizarre object and turned back to the carpenter, trying to gauge if he was about to speak. He uttered only a few measured words, insisting that he had nothing to do with the murders and that he was merely transferring ancient patterns onto wood. He claimed that he had found these designs in an old manuscript and decided to celebrate a forgotten culture through his work. His voice was calm and assured, yet in the brief pauses I sensed a tension lurking within him, as if he feared saying too much, knowing that I might piece together the whole puzzle and uncover the truth. I decided to inspect the workshop further. To the left of the entrance hung large wooden panels carved with scenes. People in ritual masks dancing around a colossal beast. On another panel, there was a wolf with an elongated human arm, and beneath it the vague outlines of victims. With each new detail, my anxiety swelled, as if I were touching upon something that I wasn't meant to see. More than once, I stumbled upon strange pouches containing unknown herbs, dangling from the ceiling beams, their pungent odor stinging my eyes to tears. At last, I realized it was time to leave. Yes, his workshop was a repository of grim secrets, but I wouldn't be able to catch the carpenter in a verbal slip right then. One thing was clear. He knew far more about the murders than he was letting on. I stepped out of the workshop under the weighty gaze of its owner, carrying with me the unnerving certainty that time was not on our side. The old man I had detained seemed to have spoken the truth, though in a confused manner. Those involved in the cult were clearly planning even more horrifying deeds. If what I saw in the workshop's basement was only a fragment, then somewhere in the darkness lay the root of the evil. Perhaps even an entire ritual chamber, hidden in ancient catacombs or caves where the carpenter had unearthed those symbols. Shortly after my visit to the carpenter, I decided to tail one of the suspects mentioned in the hotel footage. This turned out to be the owner of the small store, a man who, in my eyes, was a calm individual, never before known for any aggression. Yet my gut told me to keep an eye on him, and I didn't regret that decision. At night, he left his home with a large bag and drove along a country road heading north, toward deserted lands that had been abandoned long ago due to ruined mines and an extensive network of underground tunnels. My partner and I quietly followed in our car, keeping a safe distance with our headlights off. Darkness surrounded us, broken only by the erratic glimmers of moonlight. When we were well outside town, we spotted in the distance the half-collapsed entrances to old catacombs, said in local lore to lead to mines dug out in the previous century. Few had ventured into these parts. It was too dangerous, and there was no longer any prospect of valuable finds. It seemed that people had nothing to do there, especially on such a dark night. Yet the suspect walked without hesitation, as if he had crossed this forbidden zone countless times before. We left our car hidden behind a rocky outcrop and proceeded on foot, our weapons at the ready. My heart pounded heavily and my knees trembled slightly, as if we were entering territory ruled by something supernatural. Underfoot, sand crunched, and the air was thick with the musty scent of an abandoned cemetery, a mix of damp stone and decaying vegetation. At last, we saw our target vanish behind a wide stone entrance leading underground. Inside, there was utter darkness and a deathly silence, broken only by the distant drip of water echoing from deep within. I switched on my flashlight and for a moment caught sight of a wall covered with faded, barely discernible drawings. Among the various patterns, I immediately recognized that same wolf symbol. The damp smell struck my nostrils, and the path downward stretched before me as an endless, winding corridor. We advanced slowly, careful not to make any noise, guided by the weak beam of my flashlight and the dim flicker of a few sporadic torches left by someone along the tunnel. Occasionally, I heard distant rustlings, perhaps rats scurrying over stones or the footsteps of others ahead. Everything around us felt like a set from an old horror movie. The water stains on the walls resembled black tears, and here and there lay piles of animal bones, fresh ones, suggesting that something far more than stray pumas roamed these passages. I recalled the savage attacks on the livestock, and a deep fear began to swell within me. After several twists and turns, the corridor opened into a spacious hall, lit by a dozen torches. In the center of the room towered a massive statue of a monster clearly crafted following the same symbols. A wolf's head with a stretched, contorted snarl and hands with claws that seemed to be a blend of human fingers and beastly paws. Before the statue, a group of hooded figures stood in silent reverence. They were so absorbed in their ritual that they didn't notice our presence. I could hear their low, monotonous murmurs, like a collective whisper of incantations, and my heart beat even faster. It was as if the very air vibrated with a grim energy, simultaneously mesmerizing and terrifying. My partner and I pressed ourselves against the wall, careful not to reveal ourselves. I scrutinized the cultists. Some clutched wooden figurines adorned with the same symbols I had seen in the carpenter's workshop. At the far end of the hall, someone approached an improvised altar, carrying vessels of a red liquid and bones. Perhaps it was all part of a ritual paying homage to an ancient spirit. Suddenly, one of the cultists dragged a bound victim out of the darkness and forced her to kneel before the statue. It was a young woman. Her pale skin and trembling lips betrayed absolute terror, yet the ritual continued undisturbed. The cultists, arranged in a tight circle, began slowly chanting indistinct phrases that resembled incantations. Suddenly, the statue shuddered, and its stone surface glowed with a sinister crimson gleam. The dungeon walls, lit intermittently by the flashes of torches, seemed to quiver along with it. I felt a crushing energy building in the air, something that defied logical explanation. It was as if an ancient force was seeping through the cracks of reality, ready to burst forth. My partner lay beside me, pressed against the floor and clutching his rifle. He blinked at me. It was clear that he, too, didn't understand what was happening. Yet the relentless rhythm of the chanting grew with every second, obliterating all thoughts of tactics and a safe retreat, replaced instead by a primal fear. When the statue shone even brighter, heavy footsteps echoed across the stone floor, and one of the cultists raised his hand, a signal that silenced the others for several seconds. In that moment, I noticed the statue's surface beginning to change. The monolithic stone seemed to come alive and thin out. The carved visage of the beast at its summit parted its mouth, releasing a drawn-out sound resembling a distant moan. Time itself seemed to slow, and I saw sparks flickering around the statue before a dark, wolf-like figure emerged in the air. It bent over the victim who had lost consciousness from terror. A chill swept over me. By sheer force of will, I forced myself to take aim at the grotesque shadow. But I didn't have time to fire. The creature lunged forward with unnatural speed and clutched the victim. A short cry rang out, then was abruptly silenced. Blood-stained shreds of clothing and flesh cascaded to the floor, and the cultists erupted in a jubilant shout, convinced they had subdued the ancient deity itself. I couldn't take it any longer and opened fire on the beast. Chaos broke out immediately. Our position was discovered, and soon the whistling of bullets filled the air as some of the fanatics who were armed began a hail of lead upon us. We returned fire, but shooting in the dim light of the catacombs was no easy task. Flashes from the gunfire illuminated the stone walls, where the distorted shadows of hooded figures danced. Then suddenly the creature, devouring the captive, cast a glance our way, and a deep chill ran through me. I fired at it, yet the bullets seemed to have no effect as the beast continued advancing toward us. My pulse pounded, my thoughts tangled, and for a fleeting moment I thought, is this really the end? A sense of doom gripped us. I felt as though I were suffocating, and the walls were closing in, turning the catacombs into a trap. My partner shouted that we needed to retreat. Summoning every ounce of will, I bolted in that direction, suppressing my revulsion at the smell of blood and burning. Glancing back, I saw that the beast was already in pursuit. We raced down the tunnel, desperately trying to return fire, but it was futile. Soon we managed to burst out into fresh air, yet relief was short-lived. The monster's heavy, hoarse breathing still echoed just behind us. The ground before us was strewn with rocks and roots jutting from the cracked earth. I stumbled several times, desperately scanning for the car. In the distance, under the moonlight, a vehicle shimmered. My partner caught up with me, and we dashed toward it, knowing there was no other escape. At that very moment, the beast leaped from behind a boulder as I drew the last of my ammunition. I glanced down in despair. There clearly weren't enough bullets to stop such a creature. I remembered the shattered mirrors in the hotel and the experts' reports marveling at how the killer spent effort reducing glass to tiny shards. It meant the monster feared its own reflection. Crossing my fingers for luck, I sprinted to the car. Every fiber of my being burned with adrenaline. My lungs constricted from the lack of oxygen as, mid-run, I ripped off the side mirror, nearly tearing off part of its mount along with it. Turning around, I saw the creature already swinging its clawed paw at me. Its roar filled the air with terror, and I felt my blood run cold. But instinct prevailed. I raised the mirror, angling its reflective surface directly at the monster. In the next instant, time seemed to freeze, and the beast recoiled as if struck by an unseen force. I watched in disbelief as its eyes contorted with inexplicable panic, and then its shadow began to twist and curl, being drawn into the mirror itself. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm. I couldn't believe this was happening. But in those critical moments, I realized that this very tactic was saving us. The monster vanished into the mirror as though swallowed by a consuming fissure, leaving behind nothing but clouds of dust and shards carrying a sharp stench reminiscent of burnt flesh. The shocked cultists chasing behind recoiled and ceased firing. Their trump card, their invincible demon, had suddenly dissolved before my eyes. We leapt into the car and sped off, weaving through rocks amid muffled cries and chaotic gunfire. One bullet did hit the wing, but the engine held on, and when I looked back, all that lay ahead was a dusty road leading away from that ominous place. I exhaled deeply, as if I hadn't breathed at all for the past several minutes. The world gradually regained its color, but inside me a lingering residue of horror remained. Now I understood why mirrors were so important. They were the Achilles heel of anything dwelling beyond the realm of ordinary reality. Yet there was little comfort in that knowledge. If these people had managed to summon one monster, they could do it again. Back in town, I immediately contacted county headquarters and called for backup. I didn't want to admit that the situation had spiraled out of control, but the facts spoke for themselves. An armed cult, brutal murders, and a genuine threat capable of rattling the entire state. Soon, a SWAT team joined us, men I knew from joint training exercises. We had to explain what awaited us in the catacombs, but naturally I couldn't recount everything I'd seen. They would have thought me insane. Still, the mention of armed fanatics and potential hostages was enough to prepare the unit for a forceful incursion. Descending into the catacombs once more, I felt an ancient unease pervade the air. This time, we were better armed and equipped with night vision goggles, no longer having to rely on the trembling glow of torches. To our surprise, the cultists hadn't abandoned the place. Soon, a fierce shootout erupted in the labyrinth of underground corridors. Every passage echoed with gunfire, the walls lit up with flashes, and the stone vaults crumbled into fine dust from ricochets. We began pushing the enemy back, who were retreating deeper into the underground. Before long, we found ourselves in the very hall where we'd first encountered the horror. The monster's statue lay in ruins. At one point, we discovered a chamber holding captives, several emaciated people. The rescued individuals confessed that the cultists were planning another sacrifice. We freed them and escorted them to the surface under the protection of 2 soldiers. When I returned to the main group, I learned that the troops had taken one of the cultists captive. It was the very owner of the small store I had been tailing. His hands were tightly bound, and he looked utterly bewildered, yet finding himself under the crosshairs of automatic weapons. He began to spill about his associates, and admitted that the key figure in all of this was the carpenter. According to him, the carpenter had once discovered ancient drawings in one of the nearby caves depicting a beast that native tribes worshipped, considering it the embodiment of strength and hunting. But this beast also demanded bloody sacrifices, and its symbol supposedly gained special power when the proper ritual was performed. Impressed by the discovery, the carpenter began experimenting with the creation of ritual figurines. He found underground clients whom he promised would have all their problems solved through magical retribution against their enemies. Whoever bought one of his figurines and participated in the rituals believed they could influence events, to compel the monster to kill an irritating neighbor or rival. Luring them deeper into his schemes, the carpenter formed an actual cult, where every purchaser became both an accomplice and a hostage to the shared secret. We learned that the hotel victim had been one of those who decided to withdraw from participation and intended to expose the cult's secrets, and that was why he was torn apart. But the truly horrifying revelation came with news of a second statue. The captive claimed that the first statue had summoned the wolf-like monster, yet there was another, even more powerful one. This second statue was being prepared for a special ritual set to take place on the night of a full moon. According to the cultist, then an even stronger creature would appear, and in comparison, the previous monster would seem like a mere wolf cub. Listening to his confession, a deep chill welled up inside me. If one beast had nearly destroyed everything we had, what would happen if an even more ferocious, bloodthirsty creature emerged? I realized that ordinary bullets, and even the mirror trick, might not suffice if the creature proved too powerful. On the other hand, the shattered mirrors indicated that even the cultists feared this very vulnerability of monsters to reflections. Perhaps that was part of the mystery. A mirror worked until the monster amassed its full strength or received a boost from the ritual. We continued clearing the underground, straining our eyes in the dense gloom of corridors that wound deep beneath the earth. The stone walls were inscribed with ancient symbols and smeared with soot from torches. Everything indicated that the cultists had entrenched themselves here for the long haul. The echo of our footsteps reverberated in the depths, and every turn threatened an ambush, but we had no choice. We had to press on and finally end this nightmare. Soon, a narrow corridor led us into an expansive hall, penetrated only by a dim, hazy light. My gaze was immediately drawn to the massive silhouette of a wolf-like monster, considerably larger than its predecessor. Its fearsome fangs, eyes glowing in the half-light, devilishly black fur, and ears as pointed as spikes created the image of a living, embodied threat. The SWAT team, leading the assault, opened fire first, and the hall filled with the roar of shots as bullets crashed against the stone vaults, ricocheting with a clatter. But the beast proved more agile than we could have expected. It darted between columns and hid in the shadows, using every irregularity in the hall as cover. Periodically, it bristled its fur and roared, a sound that chilled the blood in our veins, and its almost unnatural speed rendered even our best-trained soldiers helpless against its fury. Recalling the earlier incident, I tried the mirror trick again. I retrieved a small mirror from the patrol car and held it up, hoping to catch the creature's reflection. However, the beast only growled, as if even more incensed by our primitive tactic, and no mystical effect ensued. Suddenly, the monster, its roar deafening, charged at two soldiers stationed by the nearest column, and with one powerful movement, knocked them over. For a moment, the gunfire ceased, as the others scrambled to reorient themselves without harming one another. Seizing the moment of confusion, the creature, like a colossal shadow, vaulted over a heap of debris and pounced on a group of soldiers approaching from the side. Despite their point-blank fire, the beast merely intensified its vicious roar, its eyes flashing as it demonstrated that even armor-piercing rounds had no effect on it. Blood flowed freely, and fragments of equipment scattered everywhere, a grim testament to the heavy losses among our ranks. Realizing that our chances of defeating the creature head-on were negligible, I grasped the true threat. This was the very monster the cultists intended to awaken with their new, more powerful statue. If the ritual had been completed, the beast had reached its full strength, and its mirror reflection would no longer work. Understanding that we needed a change in tactics, I knew I had to locate the statue urgently. Leaving the thick of the fighting behind, I made my way through a partially collapsed passage, crouching to avoid crossfire as bullets whistled overhead and the hoarse cry of a wounded comrade echoed from behind. Inside, fear and a steely resolve to end this madness raged within me. Moving further along the narrow corridor, I heard the monster's deafening howl, as though it sensed someone trying to thwart its victory. The tunnel soon led me into a smaller hall, yet one with an even more sinister atmosphere. Torches cast dancing shadows on the walls, and at the very center stood a massive stone statue depicting wolf-like features, but with more intricate elements. An expanded maw and a terrifying mask in place of a face. The relief around the statue's base was inscribed with indecipherable runes and swirls, clearly indicating that this idol was the key to awakening the monster. Beside the statue were 3 figures clad in ritual garments, acting instantly. One raised a pistol, another brandished a shotgun, and the third opened an ancient book, loudly reciting words that sounded like a spell. Firing in a hall with virtually no cover was a deadly risk, but I knew I couldn't allow them to complete their ritual. Pressing myself against the wall, I swiftly forced the opponents to retreat. One of them, wounded in the shoulder, flinched and dropped his weapon, while another, trying to take cover behind the statue, was ruthlessly struck down. Soon, both adversaries lay motionless on the stone floor. The hall fell into an eerie silence, disturbed only by the lingering smoke of gunfire and the dancing shadows cast by torches, a mute testament to the recent brutal clash. The statue, towering above the fallen cultists, stood as a grim monument to fanaticism, and I knew that as long as it remained intact, the monster would continue to live. Memories of the previous idol we had destroyed made it clear. Demolishing the statue was the only way to stop the threat. Without hesitation, I fumbled for the last grenade on my belt, and summoning every ounce of strength left, lobbed it at the statue's base. The grenade exploded with a deafening boom, accompanied by a shockwave of searing hot air and cascading fragments of stone that shattered the silence in an instant. The statue crumbled to pieces, and at that very moment, a prolonged wail echoed from the depths of the labyrinth, shaking the walls as if the ceiling were about to collapse. Then an ominous, final silence settled in, and I realized that the monster that had tormented our fighters in the other hall had likely vanished, just like the previous beast. When the dust finally settled amid the rubble of the statue, I noticed a man in richly adorned garments, the cult leader. Deep wounds, a bloodstain slowly spreading across his chest, and a lifeless gaze foretold his imminent end. His final, almost silent movements, along with the fanatical gleam in his eyes, spoke of a prophecy that foretold the world's doom by fire and blood. After we emerged from the catacombs, word spread that the SWAT team had repelled the remaining cultists' attack, though the losses were significant. Over the radio, we were informed that the cult leader was dead, the statue had been destroyed, and the threat of the monster had been neutralized. Reinforcements from a neighboring district soon arrived, accompanied by an entirely different group. Government agents who acted swiftly and decisively. These agents cordoned off the area, ordering that no one leave the scene, and gathered all those involved in the operation for questioning. I had to surrender my weapon and sign a stack of non-disclosure papers while I attempted to recount the entire ordeal, from the brutal murders and rituals in the catacombs to the supernatural creatures. Yet the officials tried to reduce the events to a case of mass hysteria, insisting that the monstrous images could have been mistaken for oversized wolves. Their cold, almost inhuman stares and formal tone made it clear they knew more than they were letting on, and they intended to bury the whole story. All the evidence, from spent casings to fragments of statues, was collected, and the area around the mines was declared a restricted research zone, surrounded by barbed wire and heavily patrolled. Returning to my precinct, I was filled with mixed emotions. Some saw me as a hero, while others regarded me as someone who had inadvertently become entangled in the affairs of a terrifying cult. 2 years after those events, the town gradually regained a semblance of peace, and people tried to forget the series of brutal murders and the nocturnal nightmare in the catacombs. Farms and ranches were reoccupied, though many owners still shuddered at the memories during the night. In bars and shops, talk of the past became increasingly rare, as everyone sought to avoid stirring up old fears. Yet peace never truly returned within me. Every full moon awakened a deep, suffocating dread, and questions about whether other statues capable of summoning monsters might exist, and whether the cult knew of a special date for fulfilling an ancient prophecy, kept me from ever feeling secure. I was haunted by the thought that perhaps a new adherent of dark rituals might emerge, one who, upon discovering these ancient symbols, would once again open the door to awakening an ancient evil. Government agents continued to arrive for inspections. First, to ensure I wasn't speaking with the press or revealing details of the investigation, and later to obtain further testimony. Having signed dozens of non-disclosure agreements, I still recall their cold, unfeeling stares as if I were merely an executor of their orders. Although destroying the statue that could summon an invincible monster and eliminating the cult leader temporarily lifted the threat, I understand that the evil we faced is far too ancient and powerful to vanish without a trace. Perhaps our resistance allowed the town a brief moment of respite, but deep down, I know that if a new follower of ancient rituals ever emerges, the prophecies spoken by the dying leader could become a reality that no weapon or grenade could stop. And so I continue my duty, ever vigilant, keeping several mirrors hidden away in secret spots, because that is the only way to hope to protect the town from future horrors, should the darkness ever decide to reveal its sinister maw once again. Story 2. I always considered Texas a place where the sun forgave no mistakes and the winds ceaselessly drove tumbleweeds as if it were an endless western with no beginning or end. My family and I roamed from state to state, though we often ended up staying here thanks to my father's work at oil refineries. He could be called at any moment about a new project somewhere on the edge of the desert or in a small town closer to the drilling rigs. At first, I loved these moves because every new place seemed to hold a spark of adventure. But over time, they increasingly reminded me that the further we drove into the countryside, the more desolate it became. The streetlights flickered dimly, and abandoned buildings loomed on the horizon like ghosts of bygone eras. Our new home was a typical piece of backwater Texas, surrounded by sheep farms and a few roadside diners. The houses stood at a decent distance from one another, and at night, the silence was so profound you could hear your own heartbeat. Even before sunset, my parents would lock all the doors and windows just in case of uninvited guests. They claimed it was safer that way, though they never specified exactly whom to fear. I always felt that real terror didn't come from people at all, but from something lurking beyond the bounds of ordinary logic. Perhaps it was only my imagination, but the ever-shifting, trembling shadows in the windows, flitting at the edge of my vision, reminded me that we were not alone. More and more often, especially at night, an inexplicable unease would wash over me. Every time I stepped onto the porch to breathe in the cool air, it felt as if dozens of eyes hidden by daylight were watching me from behind the old fence. In town, I could always lose myself in the roar of cars, the bustle of people, and the glow of neon signs. But here, after dark, everything fell silent. Only the creaks of the floorboards and vague silhouettes remained, shapes that defied clear identification. Each move seemed to add another page to my collection of frightening memories, and I no longer knew whether I feared the rumors of sinister figures roaming the night or the unmistakable warnings embedded in the local silence. My father left for work early and returned late, while my mother dismissed my worries as mere teenage fears. Yet in recent months, so many strange things had occurred that I could no longer tell where my imagination ended and reality began. I'd get goosebumps whenever I recalled those distant lights behind the house, the ashen gray creature in the overgrown field, the dark silhouettes lurking by the kitchen. I didn't want to tell my parents. They thought I was just flighty and overly sensitive, and they feared needless worry. But inside, I was increasingly convinced that something far beyond childish fantasies was happening, and I felt an irresistible urge to share it with someone. So I began recording everything as it unfolded. None of my family suspected that I often got up at night. Sometimes I awoke with a dry nose, and other times simply from the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. While everyone else slept, I would sneak to the kitchen in search of something tasty, or at least a gulp of water, to soothe my nerves. We had moved into this house relatively recently, and I immediately noticed that the kitchen was oddly designed. There were too many windows around the perimeter, as if someone had deliberately set it up to let in as much moonlight as possible. By day, it looked charming and bright, but at night it became a real test of one's nerves. One night, feeling a sudden stuffiness and coughing, I set out to fetch some medicine. Every footstep creaked in my ears as I moved as quietly as possible, determined not to wake my parents. The air felt stagnant, as if imbued with an unsettling sense of an uninvited presence. I never would have thought that the very atmosphere could weigh on your mind, but here it was. The shadows of the trees outside the windows appeared as hostile silhouettes. I was just about to grab the bottle when I suddenly felt someone's gaze on me. Slowly turning toward the windows, I froze. Through the glass, I could just make out two eyes fixedly staring right at me, positioned as if the creature was right at the windowsill. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard outside. I couldn't tear my eyes away until I noticed a couple more off to the side, slightly lower, as if someone had crouched down. Then others appeared, a fleeting outline here and there resembling cat or wolf ears. High above, more eyes were visible, placed too high for a human or ordinary animal. I couldn't figure out what they were. Wolves, deer, stray dogs, or something altogether inhuman. But every gaze was fixed on the kitchen, on me. I don't remember how quickly I grabbed everything I needed from the counter. Overwhelmed by fear, I was terrified that any sudden movement might provoke these creatures to shatter the glass or, worse yet, draw near to the windows. It felt as if one of them had already reached out with a hand or paw to touch the sill. Clutching a can of spray to my chest, I silently retreated toward the door. Once in the hallway, I slammed the kitchen door shut and, nearly losing my balance, dashed to my room. I closed the door behind me, propped it open with a chair, and clung to my blanket as if it could offer me protection. I lay awake for a full hour, straining to listen, hoping it was all just a trick of my imagination. But when a wolf-like howl merged with a barely discernible tapping on the walls, I realized I wouldn't soon get used to these midnight wanderings. In the morning, I resolved not to tell my parents, Explaining why I had been roaming the kitchen at 1 a.m. seemed too problematic, and their reaction might have been even worse than my own fears. A few days later, I needed to distract myself and check if I was losing my mind. My only friend, who lived nearby, agreed to join me for an evening walk along a dusty country road. In town, we rarely had such opportunities. We were always caught up in school, clubs, and mall hangouts, and here all the entertainment amounted to wandering on foot and having vague discussions about the future. We set out while it was still light on the horizon and everything seemed relatively normal. Even though there were no cars or people around, the loneliness was eased by our companionship. But as soon as the sun disappeared behind the hills, I immediately sensed a change. The chorus of crickets and birds, the nightly symphony, suddenly stopped. I noticed that even the leaves on the few trees barely moved, as if the air had frozen, thick and motionless. Perhaps we would have turned back if not for my insistence on staying away from home for a while. I kept telling myself it was just stress-induced self-suggestion, yet the deeper we ventured into the rural darkness, the more tense my friend became. I could tell he was clearly uneasy, though he tried not to show it. Suddenly, a metallic clanging shattered the silence, a sound like a massive chunk of iron striking the ground, echoing like a deafening bang that vibrated in my chest. We both stopped abruptly, fear squeezing me from within. Turning around, I saw something dark and tall moving much faster than any human. The figure seemed to glide along the road without stirring up a speck of dust. In the faint moonlight, its features were indiscernible, but it appeared nearly 2 meters tall, or even taller. I couldn't explain what it was, but it moved unnaturally smoothly and soon vanished among the sparse trees. I glanced at my friend, trying to gauge if he'd seen the same thing, and from his widened eyes, I knew I wasn't imagining it. A chill of terror passed between us like an electric shock. We had no way to call our parents or the police. Our cell reception was terrible, and we had nearly no minutes left. We realized the only option was to run home before that dark entity got any closer. We ran so fast that I could barely feel my legs. Strangely, aside from our heavy breathing and the scuff of our shoes on the gravel, there were no other sounds. The air remained sticky and far too warm for a Texan night, and it seemed as if nature itself had frozen in anticipation of something dreadful. When we finally reached my friend's house, I looked back one last time and for a moment noticed a silhouette standing on the road, motionlessly staring straight at us. A few weeks later, I sat behind the wheel of my mom's car by myself for the first time. I was 16 and just starting to learn how to drive. I already knew these skills would come in handy, given how often we had to traverse deserted highways. We pulled over at a small, abandoned diner so my mom could use the restroom while I stayed in the car, listening to classic rock on the radio. The place seemed frozen in time, a burned-out sign with indecipherable lettering, broken blinds on the windows, and a rusted heap of cars scattered around. The diner had long ceased to be a diner and resembled a haunted crypt. While a song gave way to a commercial, a man suddenly emerged from the building, a man too bulky to approach the car unnoticed. I couldn't figure out where he had come from. He was very tall, probably over 6 feet, and seemed to weigh no less than 270 pounds. His greasy, unkempt beard hung in large, tangled strands, and he wore a striped shirt in white and green, riddled with dirty stains and holes. His jeans looked as if they hadn't been washed in months. But the strangest thing was his face. Deep, dark circles under his eyes made him look as if he hadn't slept in ages, and his sickly, empty gaze sent shivers down my spine. I even turned down the radio volume, trying not to attract any attention. The man slowly and intently walked past my car as if trying to peer inside through the windshield. My heart pounded even harder, but I pretended I wasn't there by shifting down in my seat. I remembered I hadn't locked the doors. Out in a backwater like this, you rarely worry about someone attacking you in broad daylight. In that moment, I imagined how easily he could have yanked me out of the car in one swift move. His massive frame and that eerie, almost deathly look evoked a primal terror. Holding my breath, I watched as he reached a rusted truck parked in the fire zone. The cab was in such dreadful condition I couldn't understand how anyone could drive it. He got behind the wheel, fired up the engine, its roar suggesting a missing muffler, and drove off, kicking up a dusty cloud. When the truck's noise finally faded, I realized I was still too terrified to move. The thought that he could have easily opened my unlocked door washed over me in a wave of horror. I imagined him dragging me into the ruins of that diner or hauling me away in the bed of his truck, my screams lost in the emptiness. Mom returned a couple of minutes later, completely unaware that I had nearly ruined the seat from sheer fright. That very evening, I vowed never again to leave the car unlocked, even if there wasn't a soul in sight. Almost immediately after that incident, we moved again. Dad had found a more lucrative contract elsewhere. Our new home was even further from civilization, nestled among empty fields and solitary barns abandoned by previous owners. I was always drawn to exploring new places, so in the first few weeks, despite all my promises to myself, I decided to sneak out at night with a friend I'd met in the neighborhood. Under cover of darkness, we slipped out through a back window so as not to wake our parents, and set off to wander the vast field that stretched right behind our house. The air was cool and the grass rustled pleasantly under our feet. Moonlight lit our path, lending everything a mystical quality. At the edge of the field stood an old shed, its walls slanted and its roof sagging as if it might collapse at the slightest gust of wind. Curiosity got the better of us, and we approached. I was the first to step inside, carefully navigating over scattered tools and planks. The smell of damp decay hit me like a wave, and it was so dark inside that my eyes struggled to adjust. I was about to turn to my friend and suggest we leave when I suddenly felt something moving in front of me. For a moment, the moonlight filtering through the rotten roof illuminated a creature that looked human yet was unnaturally emaciated, its skin as gray as ash. Its limbs were elongated, and its eyes were pitch black, without pupils. It stared right at me, and I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I'd read online that creatures like this were called rake, urban legends or mere fabrication, I thought. But in that moment I saw it clearly. The stench of decay and something repulsively foul filled the space between us. And then the creature darted swiftly toward the back wall of the shed and vanished, leaving only a low hissing sound behind. I froze in terror, unable to believe my eyes, until my friend tugged my hand and pointed toward the door. We bolted out, and behind us we heard a piercing scream, a sound that blended a guttural growl with a shriek like the furious roar of a dinosaur mixed with the screech of a monkey. My heart pounded so fiercely I could barely breathe, and it felt as if the creature were about to leap from around the corner and attack. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom's number, not caring how I would later explain what had happened. There we stood in the middle of the field, huddled together, scanning every direction. When Mom finally arrived, without uttering a word, we climbed into the back seat. I trembled from both adrenaline and cold. I couldn't decide which was scarier, the ravenous beast lurking in the darkness or the realization that this rake was very much real. It seemed to me that if I wasn't careful, one day it would find me. and I made a firm decision: no more night walks.